The world was watching the events unfolding in Israel with great attention. Every day, news channels carried images of conflict, protests, and voices crying out for justice. People debated politics, history, and human rights, but among Muslims, there was also a deep spiritual discussion. Many were asking if what was happening had already been foretold in the Quran centuries ago. This question reached scholars, imams, and ordinary believers who wanted to connect their present struggles with the timeless words of their holy book. In a small university in Lahore, Professor Amina sat with her students in a seminar room filled with books stacked along the walls. She had been teaching Quranic studies for years, guiding her students not only to understand the words of the Quran, but also to see how those words lived in the hearts of people across generations. On that morning, a student raised a question that shifted the entire discussion. The young man asked, "Madame, is what we see happening in Israel today written in the Quran? Did Allah already tell us this would happen?" The room fell silent. Every face turned toward her, waiting for an answer. Professor Amina did not rush to respond. She closed her notebook gently and looked at her students. "The Quran," she said softly, "is a book of guidance. It speaks of nations that rise and fall, of justice and oppression, of exile and return. Many verses speak of the children of Israel and their history. Some scholars believe these verses carry lessons that reach into our own time. But to say that every event is predicted word for word is something we must treat with care." The students listened carefully. One of them, a young woman named Sana, spoke up. "But my grandmother always says the Quran has told us about these events, that every time we see injustice in Palestine, it reminds her of the verses about Bani Isra'il." Amina nodded. "Yes, Sana, for many families the Quran is not just history. It is a living witness. They see their pain reflected in its verses, and they take comfort in knowing that Allah is aware of the struggles of His people." That evening, Amina returned home and opened an old folder of research papers she had collected over the years. Inside was a faded photocopy of a manuscript she once studied during her time in Cairo. The manuscript contained marginal notes from a medieval scholar who had linked certain verses of the Quran with events of displacement and conflict in the Holy Land. The scholar had written that history would repeat itself, that oppression would return, and that people would once again struggle for the sacred land. She remembered how her teacher in Cairo had told her, "Every generation reads the Quran in the light of its own experiences. The words do not change, but the eyes that read them do." Amina thought about this as she listened to the rain outside her window. The question her student asked was not just an academic one. It was the question of a generation that saw the images of war, of children under rubble, of families displaced, and wanted to know if Allah had already prepared them for this test. The next day, Amina called her old colleague, Nabil, who worked in an archive in Cairo. He was the one who had once shown her the manuscript. When she asked if he still had access to it, his voice carried excitement. "Yes, I still have the notes. And you would be surprised, Professor, how many young people write to me now asking the same thing. Did the Quran foretell what is happening in Israel today?" Amina decided that she needed to travel once again. To answer her students honestly, she could not rely on memory or half-faded notes. She wanted to see the manuscript again, to speak with people whose families lived this reality, and to listen to how they connected their suffering to the words of the Quran. She knew that this journey would not give her one simple answer, but perhaps it would help her understand how faith, history, and current events were woven together in the lives of ordinary people. When she boarded the plane to Cairo, her heart was restless. She carried with her not only her own curiosity, but also the heavy questions of her students, the hopes of Sana's grandmother, and the voices of millions who believed the Quran had already spoken about what was happening. As the plane lifted into the sky, Amina whispered a prayer, "O Allah, guide me to truth and let me see what you want me to see." The journey had begun, and she did not know where it would lead. But she was certain of one thing. The Quran was not silent. Its words had crossed centuries, and in every age they spoke again to those who were willing to listen. Cairo welcomed Amina with its familiar mixture of noise and warmth. The streets were alive with vendors calling out their goods, taxis honking, and the scent of fresh bread rising from corner bakeries. She felt both comfort and urgency as she walked through the old alleys toward the library where Nabil was waiting. The city carried centuries of stories in its stones, and Amina wondered if one of those stories was waiting to guide her. Nabil greeted her with a wide smile and a stack of folders under his arm. He was younger than her, but his passion for manuscripts always made him look like a scholar who had lived 100 years. He led her into a quiet reading room where the air smelled of parchment and ink. On the table lay the very manuscript Amina had once seen long ago. Its pages were fragile, edges browned by time, but the calligraphy still glowed with elegance. Nabil carefully pointed to the marginal notes. The handwriting belonged to a scholar who had lived nearly 800 years earlier. The note referred to verses in Surah Al-Isra, where Allah mentions the journeys of the children of Israel and the consequences of their actions. The scholar had written that these verses contained signs, not only about the past, but also about recurring struggles. In the Holy Land, he believed history would mirror itself, and that corruption and oppression would rise again before truth. Returned, Amina traced the words with her eyes. She could feel the weight of generations who had read these verses in different contexts. For some, the verses were reminders of divine justice. For others, they were warnings, and for many in the present, they had become a lens through which to see the turmoil in Israel and Palestine. That evening, Nabil introduced Amina to a small group of students who gathered weekly to study tafsir. They welcomed her kindly and asked her to speak. She shared what she had seen in the manuscript and asked them what the verses meant to them today. One student, Karim, raised his hand. "When I see the news," he said, "I feel pain. And when I hear these verses, I feel that Allah already told us this pain would come. It is as if He is reminding us to be patient and strong." Another student, Fatima, added, "For me, it is not about politics. It is about believing that Allah is watching. He knows the oppressors and the oppressed. That is what gives me peace." Amina listened carefully. Their words reminded her that prophecy was not always about predicting dates or headlines. It was about finding meaning in times of suffering. People used the Quran to hold themselves together when the world around them seemed to break apart. The next morning, Amina visited an old professor of Islamic history named Dr. Hassan. He had spent his life studying how Muslims throughout history had read the Quran during times of crisis. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the fire of conviction. "My daughter," he said, "every time a nation faced hardship, they turned to these verses. In Spain, in Baghdad, in Damascus, people said the Quran had foretold their struggle. This is not because the Quran changes. It is because human pain repeats itself, and Allah's words remain timeless." Amina wrote his words in her notebook. She realized that what was happening in Israel today was not the first time people had turned to these verses for answers. It was part of a much larger pattern of history, where communities found reflection of their struggles in the eternal words of the Quran. After a week in Cairo, Amina knew her journey was not complete. She had read the manuscript, spoken with scholars, and listened to students, but something was still missing. To understand how people connected the Quran to current events, she needed to meet those who lived through the conflict every single day. She decided to travel to Jerusalem. Arranging the journey was not simple. Permissions were required, documents were checked, and every step was filled with tension. Yet Amina felt a strong pull in her heart, as if Allah Himself was guiding her steps. She boarded a bus from Amman to the border, carrying only her notebook, her Quran, and a few belongings. Crossing the border was an exhausting experience. Soldiers questioned her, checked her bag, and looked at her passport again and again. But finally, she stepped onto the streets of Jerusalem. The air was different here, heavy with history, yet alive with voices in many languages. She saw domes and minarets rising together, markets buzzing with life, and at the same time she could sense the tension that ran through every corner. Her first meeting was with a woman named Samar, who ran a community center in East Jerusalem. Samar welcomed her like an old friend. The room smelled of freshly baked bread and thyme. Children's laughter echoed in the background, even though their lives were shaped by checkpoints and walls. Amina asked her how the Quran shaped their hope. Samar replied with quiet strength, "When we recite the verses about the land and the people of Israel, we do not think of them only as history. We think of them as Allah telling us that injustice does not last forever. This belief keeps us alive." That night Amina stayed with Samar's family. Over dinner, Samar's father, an old man named Ibrahim, spoke of his childhood. He remembered the day his family was forced to leave their village. "I carried nothing but the Quran my grandfather had given me," he said. "When I read Surah Al-Isra that night, I felt as if Allah was speaking directly to me. It was not about predicting the future. It was about telling me that Allah sees every tear and every struggle." His voice trembled as he spoke, but his eyes were steady. Amina felt humbled. The verses she had studied in classrooms and manuscripts were alive in the hearts of these people. For them, the Quran was not a distant text. It was a companion in the darkest nights. The following days, she met families, imams, and young activists. Each person had their own way of connecting the Quran to the events unfolding around them. Some said the Quran had foretold the corruption and arrogance they witnessed. Others said it gave them strength to resist and hope for justice. A few were cautious, reminding her that the Quran was guidance, not a newspaper. But all of them agreed that its words were never silent. One evening, Samar took Amina to a small gathering of women who met weekly to read Quran together. They recited softly, their voices blending in the candle-lit room. After the recitation, one of the women said, "When we read these verses, we feel Allah is telling us, 'I know what you are going through.' That is enough for us." Amina realized then that the story she was searching for was not about proving or disproving prophecy. It was about understanding how people found themselves inside the Quran, and how the Quran gave them courage to face each day. As she wrote in her notebook late at night, Amina thought of her students back in Lahore. She wanted to tell them that yes, many Muslims believed what was happening in Israel was foretold in the Quran, but not always in the way they imagined. It was not always about exact predictions of battles and politics. Often it was about cycles of history, lessons for humanity, and the unchanging truth that Allah's justice prevails in the end. Her journey was far from over. She still needed to meet others, to hear more voices, and to piece together the larger picture. But deep in her heart, she already knew one thing. The Quran was not only a record of the past or a prediction of the future. It was a living guide, and those who listened to it carefully could find in its verses both warning and hope. The sun was setting over Jerusalem when Amina sat on the rooftop of Samar's house. The call to prayer echoed across the city, weaving through domes, churches, and minarets. She could see both the golden dome of the rock and the grey lines of concrete walls in the distance. It struck her that this city carried both beauty and pain at the same time. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with pages of stories, but she felt as if she had only begun to touch the surface of the truth she was searching for. The next day, Samar introduced her to a young man named Yusuf. He was a university student who had grown up in Jerusalem under constant restrictions. Despite the hardships, his face carried determination. He told Amina, "When I read Surah Al-Isra, I feel as if Allah is speaking about us directly. It is not just history. It is a reminder that oppression does not last forever. Allah tells us that those who spread corruption will be held accountable. That gives me courage to study, to resist, and to hope." Yusuf took her on a walk through the narrow streets of the old city. Every corner told a story. Some walls had bullet marks. Some doors were closed forever, their families long gone. Yet markets were alive with vendors selling spices, bread, and olives. Children ran in the streets, their laughter echoing despite the heavy atmosphere. Amina wrote in her notebook, "Life refuses to surrender, even in the shadow of conflict." Later that evening, Amina visited Al-Aqsa Mosque for the first time on her trip. As she stepped inside, her heart trembled. The mosque was filled with worshippers of all ages, their prayers rising together in unison. She stood silently, listening to the Imam recite verses of the Quran. When he reached the verse in Surah Al-Isra that spoke of the children of Israel and their journeys, she noticed the faces of the worshippers. Some wept silently, some nodded with deep faith. To them, these were not distant words. They were a mirror of their present struggle. After the prayer, Amina spoke with the Imam, Sheikh Khalid. He welcomed her kindly and listened to her questions. "People often ask me if the Quran predicted today's events," he said. "My answer is this: the Quran teaches us that history repeats itself. When nations turn away from justice and truth, they face consequences. When people oppress others, they eventually fall. What we see today may not be a direct prophecy written word for word, but it is certainly part of the cycle Allah has described." For believers, that is enough proof. Amina felt the depth of his words. It was not about exact predictions, but about understanding patterns of human behavior and divine justice. She realized that this was how the Quran remained alive, not as a book of dates, but as a book of timeless lessons. The next day, Amina traveled to Ramallah to meet families living under difficult conditions. The drive was long and filled with checkpoints. At each stop, soldiers checked papers and bags. She saw children waiting for hours just to go to school. Yet among the people she met, there was a strong spirit of resilience. One family invited her for dinner. The father, Mahmoud, told her about the day he lost his home. He had kept only one thing with him, a small Quran passed down from his grandfather. With tears in his eyes, he said, "When I opened it that night, the verse I read spoke of exile and return. It was as if Allah knew exactly what I was feeling. For me, that was a sign. Maybe it was foretold, or maybe it was simply Allah reminding me that He is with us in every hardship." Amina was deeply moved. She saw how the Quran was not just studied in classrooms, but lived in the hearts of these people. For them, the verses were a source of strength, a light in darkness. They did not care whether scholars debated the meaning of prophecy. What mattered to them was that the Quran gave them hope. She spent several days listening to stories. An elderly woman told her how she recited the same verse every time she passed a checkpoint, believing it gave her courage. A young boy said he memorized Surah Al-Isra because his father told him it was their story. Everywhere Amina turned, she saw the Quran woven into daily life. One evening, she met with a small group of young writers and activists. They gathered in a simple room with books stacked on the shelves. They spoke passionately about justice, freedom, and faith. One of them, a girl named Mariam, said, "For us, the Quran is not only a reminder of the past. It is a warning for the present. It tells us what happens when arrogance and corruption spread. So when we look at our situation, we see it clearly written in those verses." Her words struck Amina deeply. She realized that while academics like her often searched for careful explanations, ordinary believers found direct connections between their lives and the Quran. For them, the holy book was not abstract. It was living proof. Late that night, Amina sat by her window, listening to the distant sounds of the city. She opened her notebook and read her own notes from Cairo, from the manuscript, from the voices of scholars, and now from the hearts of ordinary people. The pattern was clear. The Quran was not a book of predictions in the way newspapers forecast events. Instead, it was a mirror of human history. What people saw in it depended on their time, their pain, and their faith, but still, she could not ignore the fact that many Muslims believed what was happening in Israel was indeed foretold in the Quran. Their conviction was not born of academic debate, but of lived experience. For them, the verses were a testimony that Allah's promise of justice would never fail. The next day, she received a call from David, the journalist she had met earlier on the plane. He had heard of her research and wanted to meet. They arranged to sit in a small cafe near the old city. David was curious but respectful. "I've interviewed many families," he said. "They all say the Quran speaks about today's conflict. Do you think this is prophecy, or is it simply the way people find meaning?" Amina thought carefully before answering. "I think it is both," she said. "It is prophecy in the sense that the Quran describes cycles of justice and oppression that repeat in history. But it is also meaning, because people use those verses to make sense of their suffering. The Quran gives them language to hold on to hope." David nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is why it continues to inspire," he said. "It is not frozen in time. It moves with people." As they parted ways, Amina felt more certain of her mission. She was not searching for one final answer, but for the living truth that connected text and reality. She wanted to show her students and the world that the Quran was not a silent book. It spoke in every age, and its words carried power not because they predicted events like a calendar, but because they reminded humanity of Allah's justice and mercy. Her journey was not yet over. There were still voices to hear, more places to see, and deeper reflections to write. But she already knew the heart of the message. What was happening in Israel today was not separate from the Quran, in the faith of the people, in their resilience and in their unshaken belief. The Quran had already spoken. Weeks had passed since Amina first arrived in Jerusalem. Her notebook was now filled with stories, quotes and reflections that carried both pain and hope. Each page was heavy with the voices of people she had met, yet every word also carried a spark of faith. She knew her journey was reaching its conclusion, but she felt that the real story was just beginning. On her last Friday in the city, she returned once again to Al-Aqsa Mosque. The courtyards were crowded, men and women entering with calm determination, children walking alongside their parents. The sound of footsteps and prayers blended together. Amina sat quietly at the edge of the courtyard, watching as thousands raised their hands to the sky in unison. She felt a wave of emotion, as if the centuries of history were alive around her. The khutbah that day was powerful. The Imam reminded the people of the verse from Surah Al-Isra, where Allah warns that corruption and arrogance bring destruction, but that after hardship comes relief. His words echoed across the courtyard, and Amina noticed how the people clung to them with strength. To them, this was not only religious teaching, it was a promise that their suffering was not endless. After the prayer, she spoke with a group of women who invited her to sit with them. One of them, an elderly grandmother, held her hand and said, "My dear daughter, when you go back to your country, tell the world that we are not broken. The Quran told us this would happen, and it tells us also that justice will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but Allah never fails His promise." Those words stayed in Amina's heart as she walked back through the streets of Jerusalem. She realized that this was the true meaning she had been searching for. Whether one called it prophecy, history, or reflection, the Quran had already shaped the way people understood their lives. It gave them the courage to endure and the hope to rise again. That evening, she met David once more to share her final thoughts. They sat in the same small cafe where they had spoken before. She told him about the grandmother's words, about the resilience of families, and about the unshakable faith that connected every story she had heard. David listened in silence, then said, "So the Quran does not only tell them what happened, it tells them who they are," Amina smiled. "Exactly. It is not just a record of the past or a prediction of the future. It is a living message. That is why even today people say what is happening was foretold in the Quran, because for them the verses breathe in every moment of their struggle." The next morning, Amina packed her bags. She stood for a long time at her window, looking out over the city that had changed her forever. The golden dome shone brightly in the distance, and beyond it she saw the grey walls and checkpoints. Two worlds in one city, two truths bound together. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking Allah to grant justice and peace. On the plane back home, she opened her notebook one last time. On the final page, she wrote, "The Quran is not a book of silent pages. It is alive in the hearts of people. It speaks of justice, of oppression, of exile, and of return. It does not give us exact dates or names, but it gives us the pattern of history. And in that pattern, people see themselves. That is why they say what is happening in Israel today was foretold in the Quran, because in every verse they find their struggle, their strength, and their hope." As the plane rose above the clouds, Amina closed her notebook with a deep sense of peace. Her journey had shown her that the Quran was more than a subject of research. It was a guide, a mirror, and a promise. She knew now that she would spend the rest of her life sharing this truth with others. For the people of Palestine, the Quran was not only a holy book, it was their story. And that story was still being written.